Welcome to another episode of Eat, Sleep, Drive, where we're going to be doing an in-depth look into the Forester Wilderness. If you haven't heard of the Wilderness Edition that Subaru is doing, they basically take what they're already very good at Subaru and turn it up to 11. So this is a more rugged, more off-road capable vehicle that's probably meant to appeal to a little more adventurous lifestyle than just driving on your typical street. And what we're going to be doing today is taking a look outside, inside. I'm going to show you all the features of this vehicle, as well as throw a bike in the back to see how usable or not it is. And then most importantly, we're going to take it out on the road to see what it's like to drive. Starting first with the exterior, you can already kind of see what's different about this compared to the standard Forester. You get these over fenders and black plastic front and rear bumper. These are basically designed to prevent you from worrying about scratching your paint. Maybe if you take this off-road and there's some brush that scrapes along the side, you're a little less worried about it with these black plastic pieces, which are probably a lot easier to replace, but also they're less likely to scratch because they're not painted. You may notice as well the front and rear bumpers are actually different than the standard Forester. What they did was change the approach and departure angle of this vehicle. What the heck does that mean? It's basically the angle of attack to where when you're about to roll over something. And ultimately what that means is you're less likely to bottom this vehicle out when you're in an off-road scenario because you have a little more clearance in the front and back with the front bumper. You also have a revised suspension for this vehicle, and this is one of the biggest selling points for the Wilderness Editions. They revised the suspension, give you a ½ inch more ground clearance, and also increase the travel of the shocks. And that's one thing that we're really going to touch on as we go for the drive, because it's definitely something that separates this from just your standard badge engineering that sometimes manufacturers do, where they stick an off-road sticker on the back and they say, hey, that's good, we have an off-road edition. This one actually has some of the chops associated with a true off-road edition. Likewise, with off-road edition cars, you typically want to have a more robust tire, so they went with these Yokohama Geolandar tires on sort of a smaller rim from traditional SUVs. This is a 17-inch rim, but that gives you a nice meaty sidewall, which once again will aid in that ride that we'll talk about later that is coupled with the suspension. Makes it quite nice actually. Popping the hood, we get the same engine that's in every other Forester. It's a 2.5 liter naturally aspirated engine making about 182 horsepower. And that's either a good or bad thing depending on your viewpoint. It's a good thing because it's a very simple engine. There's not a lot going on, no turbochargers, superchargers to complicate things. But it's sort of a bad thing in the sense that it doesn't create a whole ton of power, which we'll talk more about when we get on the drive. Now, another thing worth noting in mechanical changes, they changed the gearing a little bit with this Wilderness Edition to make it a little more off-road friendly. And that also had the other subsequent effect of changing the towing rating. You can actually tow 3,000 pounds with this, which is more than the standard Forester. One final change they made is actually in reinforcing the roof rails so they can support more weight. So if you have something like a rooftop tent that you want to put on top, or maybe just a whole bunch of junk that you can't fit inside, it's a little more capable of handling that. Let's talk interior. If you watched that Outback Wilderness review I did last year, a lot of this is really very similar. These seats, if not are exactly the same, feel super similar. They are extremely comfortable and they're quite a soft material. I'm not sure how these will hold up over long term, but they're definitely made of a really supple material, and they're supposed to be a little more rugged and easier to clean. So if you get them dirty, it's not a big deal. That extends to a lot of different touch points in this interior. The center console is covered in it. The door itself is covered in it. And then they actually stitched the dash as well. So has a really nice look and feel to it, similar to, once again, the Outback Wilderness. You get these sort of gold accents that are specific to the Wilderness Edition. Now, I keep bringing up the Outback Wilderness, but it's almost like its own natural competitor, even though it's made by the same manufacturer. One of the things that I really like about this compared to the Outback Wilderness is that when you step up to the only package that is actually offered with this, which gives you a bigger screen and Android Auto and all those things, when you do that in the Outback Wilderness, you get this giant screen and everything is controlled from that. Whereas with this car, it's a much more modest screen, which at first glance you might say, who doesn't like a bigger screen, right? Which is fine, except for the fact that with the Outback Wilderness, all of the HVAC controls, the heated seats, and all that stuff is kind of buried within that screen. And this is so much more traditional, I'll say, and easier to use. So I personally really prefer the layout of this. So you have your screen here where you do your multimedia, you connect to your Bluetooth or your Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, and then you still have your knobs, buttons, and switches to adjust your HVAC. You have a physical button for your heated seats, high and low. Very, very simple, and I just prefer that. I think this will age better. There's a lot less chance that this stuff will break because it's very simple, and B, it's just easier to use when you're driving along and you can just adjust a knob compared to digging through a menu. I personally think that's a lot safer and a lot easier. So those are my opinions on it. Obviously it's up to you guys, but it's a very Subaru in here. Like if you get in any Subaru, this feels like any other Subaru. You get a tiny screen up top which displays some information like trip information or fuel economy. Speaking of, it's 25 city and 28 highway, making it 26 combined, which is a bit lower than the regular Forester. And you could thank the fact that this is lifted, so the aero is a little bit worse, and it's on bigger tires. So unfortunately, it does get slightly worse fuel economy, so there is a price to pay for that more off-road capability. But other than that, this is a very standard and straightforward interior, which depending on who you are, can be a good or bad thing. I like it because it's very simple, it's very easy to get in and immediately know how to use everything. All right, let's get going here and drive the Forester Wilderness and see what this thing is like on the road. I want to start here. I'm in the mountains. I'm in the Rockies here in Denver, Colorado, and I'm going to start with a merge onto the highway. A couple reasons for that. I'm just going to floor it 40 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour. We're going downhill at this point, 60 miles an hour. What's important and different from this car, and we'll talk about the suspension. I think that's probably the biggest point. We'll get to that, but I want to start first with the engine. So this is a 2.5 liter naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine, and that's not super uncommon in this category, but it's starting to go away. There's a lot of manufacturers are going to small displacement turbocharged engines. And what's the significance of that? Well, turbocharged engines essentially cram air, and they can be smaller displacement, smaller sized, and create the same amount of power. And that's good for fuel economy, that's good for making power. But the problem I tend to have with turbocharged engines is that they can often be unreliable. And I don't want to generalize because not every turbocharged engine is unreliable, but let's just think about it this way. The more complicated and more doodads you have on an engine, just the more probability that something's going to go wrong, right? Like if we just think of statistics, the more complicated something is, the more likely something is to go wrong. So what I like about the Forester is that it is very simple. This is a simple engine. It's going to be extremely simple for you to maintain and fix. It's going to be inexpensive to do. So I think the play is, if you are looking at something to own long term, I personally always suggest to my friends, buy something naturally aspirated like this, because it's just going to be cheaper for you long term and less trouble free. If you're looking at a CR-V, if you're looking at a CX-5, or maybe another Subaru, the Outback Wilderness, a lot of those models are turbocharged. Now they do offer, some of them will have naturally aspirated engines similar to this, but most of them are turbocharged. So that is an important distinction. Now, the simplicity is a nice piece, of course, right? But what's the downside? The downside is what just happened back there, where I am at altitude and I'm accelerating or attempting to accelerate, and this engine just doesn't have a whole ton of power. So that's the flip side, is that what you sacrifice in simplicity, you also sacrifice, or I shouldn't say sacrifice simplicity. You have simplicity here, but by gaining that simplicity, you sacrifice the power output of a turbocharged engine. So 182 horsepower is just barely adequate for this car, I would say. It's not to the point of it being bad by any means, but it's just adequate enough. And I think, once again, it's further made worse because I'm at 6,000-7,000 feet of elevation. I took this car up to go ski, and at 10,000 feet of elevation, you can really tell that this is a naturally aspirated four-cylinder. Turbocharged engines are less affected by altitude. So that's an important distinction. Once again, keeping the car long-term, definitely recommend a naturally aspirated engine. If you're going to lease it, it's always going to be under warranty and you don't really care if it breaks, sure, get a turbocharged engine. It gets slightly better fuel economy, it makes a little more power, but knowing that ultimately long-term, you might deal with some leaks, you might have to replace the turbocharger, it might be a little more expensive. So that's what I want to start with. The other thing that you might have noticed during that whole experience was that the engine didn't really change tone, right? So this car has a CVT transmission, which is quite typical for pretty much every car in this segment anymore. And that stands for continually variable transmission. Essentially, the gear ratios are infinite, and it's unlike old transmissions that you can think of where, you know, it shifts and you feel the shift go from one gear to the other. So I'm gonna get over here. Good brakes on this car. When we talk about the transmission, though, it's geared in such a way that it's optimized for fuel economy. So I'm pushing the foot to the floor here. And it takes an already quite sewing machine engine and makes it worse. And when I say makes it worse, it's the same engine, of course. But the problem with it is the fact that it essentially just keeps it at a certain RPM and you just get drone, right? It just sounds like this just droning on rackety engine. So what's funny about that is it's probably the lowest point of the car. Everything else about this is a very nice driving experience. Like the whole experience from a luxury standpoint is on point with this car. The suspension is super compliant. Other than when you go full throttle and the engine drones on, it's extremely quiet. We were just on the highway. I don't have to raise my voice. The noise from wind is quite low. The noise from the road, the tires contacting the road, is actually shockingly low in this car, especially given that this has all-terrain tires. Typically, the knobbier the tires, the worse the noise is going to be in the cabin, right? Not so in this car. So I kind of started, I hate to start with kind of the negatives first, but the engine being a little bit drony and a little underpowered is really the only shortcomings I can think of this car. Now let's get into what makes it really a great vehicle. This suspension is fantastic. It is so compliant over rough pavement, over potholes, over gravel. It's just like, it's the perfect suspension for a daily driver, and it gives you a lot of ground clearance. So you never have to worry about bottoming out on certain situations, you know, going into embankments or, you know, whatever it may be. Maybe you have a steep driveway or something like that. It has a lot of ground clearance, and this suspension, it just floats. It has quite a bit of body roll. So, you know, when you get into the handling front, this is not a sports car. It kind of rolls around right a bit, but it's very controlled. And that's what's most important in a suspension, is that even if it has a lot of movement, it's controlled. And that's exactly what this has. So you go over bumps, you just don't feel them. Or you hardly feel them, I should say. Of course, you feel them a little bit. But it's definitely the biggest selling point with this car is the suspension. They give you more suspension travel, it doesn't bottom out, and the ride is just very supple. It's perfect. It's really perfect for exactly what this is, you know, a daily driven car that you can occasionally take on adventures. You can throw all your crap in the back, you can go skiing, you can go biking, you can go climbing, and you could drive on some fire roads, light off-roading, and it's just absolutely perfect for that. Couple that with the seats. I mentioned the seats in the interior segment. They're also very squishy and comfy. Just kind of goes with the overall theme of this vehicle. Now, they also pack a lot of technology in here. They pack adaptive cruise control. They pack lane departure and lane centering. These are things that you get with this eyesight system. That is what Subaru calls their sort of safety suite. And having adaptive cruise control that will pace the car in front of you, automatically slow down for you, really adds to the experience. I think the lane departure is a little bit overreactive, especially if you're in lanes that are, pretty narrow. If they're big enough, it won't really bother you. The lane centering does tend to bounce back and forth a wee bit, but it's nice to have. It's really nice to have those features because some cars don't have those as standard, and you get that as standard here. So ultimately, what I have to say about this car is that if you are someone who is adventurous, you occasionally go on outdoor excursions, and you want something that's going to treat you right on a daily basis, and something that's very simple, not going to break probably, and it's just easy to use. I hopped in this car when I got it for a week, and it was easy, and it was very straightforward to be able to adjust the climate control, get all my stuff set up within the screen here. And I can't say that for a lot of cars I get into. A lot of cars, settings are deep within menus. I have physical buttons. I really like the physical buttons for the heated seats. And these are things that they're not very sexy, right? Like when it comes to selling cars, you want all like the latest and greatest gadgets. That's what sells cars. But the problem is then once you live with the car, you start to realize like, oh, these are actually quite important. I actually do really like having a physical switch to be able to put my heated seat on as opposed to dig through a menu. Or I have a simple actual volume knob. I don't have to go digging through the subsystems. These are, once again, little things, seemingly insignificant, but over the course of an ownership experience where you're interacting with the car for a very long time, they make a big difference. So I think this is a fantastic package. I would highly recommend it to anyone that is of an adventure mindset and wants something great daily that they can basically use for everything. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below of the Subaru Forester Wilderness. I love that Subaru is doing these wilderness editions. It's just like a more Subaru. It just turns Subaru up a little bit more, and it shows exactly what they're really good at. So let me know in the comments below. Would love if you subscribed if you really enjoyed the video, and also hit that like button if you enjoyed it as well. I'll see you on the next one for next week when we have the Subaru WRX on the channel. So we'll inject a little fun into this one next time. See you guys.